people who collected and wrote down the stories of our Bible were greatly influenced by the culture in which they lived. And one of their cultural traditions was to tell multiple versions of the same story. And we see evidence of that in the book of Genesis. In fact, we find that very thing in the first recorded chapters of Genesis, the stories about creation. A couple of weeks ago, we read the first creation story in Genesis. Remember, in the beginning was that formless planet of chaotic fluid. And God brought order to the planet by separating light and dark, day and night, sky, water, earth. And the sky got filled with sun, moon, stars, and birds, the water with swimming creatures and sea monsters, and the earth was filled with vegetation and living creatures and human beings, and God saw that everything God created was very good. And that's the first creation story that we find in the book of Genesis. The second creation story we find is the one that I just read to you this morning. Now, I hope that you notice the stories are not the same, and they're not supposed to be. That would spoil the whole effect. And the effect is to draw the narrative out, to make it longer and richer, and quite frankly, to make it more exciting. So in the first narrative, creation happens in that rhythmic cycle of 6 days, remember? But in the second account, there is no mention about time at all. In the first story, there's too much water. God has to separate the waters from above, from the waters below. Remember the little picture you had in your bulletin? And God had to gather up all the water from below in order to make the dry land from underneath appear. In the second story, water kind of seems hard to find. The author says that God hasn't rained on the earth yet. There's only a river that comes up out of the ground. In the first account, human beings, male and female, are created at the same time as a culminating act of creation. But there's no detail given to us about their coming into being. God just says, let's create male and female human beings, and then God creates them in God's image. In the second story, God creates one human out of the dirt. And then God plants that human in a paradise garden and creates all the creatures that dwell on earth and all the creatures that dwell in the sky. And finally, God creates a second human from the rib of the first. If we read the text as it's offered to us, then we're not going to try to fit these stories together in a nice, neat little package. They aren't supposed to wind together like that, because we learn a great deal about the divine-human relationship in the differences of the stories. So this morning we're looking more specifically at this creation story number 2. And I suppose that you noticed while I was reading, I left out a rather large chunk of it. Did you notice? Did you notice specifically that I left out the part about the snake? I left out the part about the man and the woman being driven out of paradise when they ate that forbidden fruit. I didn't read about Adam and Eve's sons. I read their names. There were 3 of them, right? That's important. Cain, Abel, and Seth. I read their names and the account of their birth, but I didn't read that part where Cain kills Abel. Well, I'm the preacher. I can read what I want to. And I read the good stuff. This morning, I'm using this highly acclaimed translation by Dr. Richard Elliott Friedman. It's in my office if you want to peruse it. I'll let you look at it. I'm using Dr. Friedman's translation because of the interpretation he offers us of verse 18 in chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 18, as translated by Dr. Friedman, reads, "And Yahweh God said, it's not good for the human to be by himself. I'll make him a strength corresponding to him." Now, if you were looking at the Pew Bible, or perhaps you have another version that you've brought with you from home, you may have read that God wanted to make a suitable helper for the man. Did you see that, Sue? Yeah. A suitable helper. Well, Dr. Friedman explains that the root word in Hebrew is the original text of the Old Testament. So the root word in Hebrew that often gets translated as helper can also be very correctly translated as strength. So God's intention is to offer the man a suitable or a corresponding strength. A strength that corresponds to his own. I find it explicitly poignant that this narrative about the human drama as it relates to our relationship with God can be properly understood in this particular way. In the first creation story, humans are made in the likeness or in the image of God, reminding us that there is something of God in everybody who walks the planet. In this second story, we're reminded that God made the human species as a corresponding strength. Boy, did we miss that? We're not inclined to see each other like that, as a corresponding strength. I mean, we're not inclined to see each other in that way. Human beings are far more likely to assert our strength and power over one another than to recognize each other as a corresponding strength or as an equivalent potency of life. As nations, as corporations, as social groups, as cultures, we are in fact greatly offended by any implication that we might be just merely equal to one another. But as Dr. Friedman very wisely translates this passage, humans best represent our creative purpose when we accept and settle into our equality, our sameness as human beings. In the part of the story that I left out, the man and the woman eat from that forbidden tree of the knowledge of good and bad. Now, remember in the first creation story, God says, everything which I created is very good. But in this expanded version, the humans created by God want to make that judgment for themselves. They want to know what is good and what is bad so that they can determine what is good and what is bad about God's creation. They want to put themselves in the place of deciding what is right and what is wrong about each other and about the garden and about the creatures that live in the garden, so they eat from the tree. This is going to be a recurring biblical theme. You know that, right? We're going to see it over and over again. Humans trying to take on the role of God. The humans eat the fruit in order to get what only God can have. They eat the knowledge of good and bad. They partake in that which makes them judge and jury over creation, over the work that God has done. I didn't hear the whole conversation, but I heard the Sunday school class talking this morning about judgment and making judgments, holding things in judgment. Don't know the whole conversation there, but I can tell you that in this passage, the man and the woman eat in order to gain power over God and power over each other. So now they are no longer a corresponding strength. They are a competitive, competing strength. Do you see that? Same story with Cain and Abel. Cain takes Abel out into the field and murders him. He asserts his power over him. He declares to his kid brother with a violent, deadly blow, "We are not corresponding strengths. I am stronger. I am better. I am good and you are bad, and I'm going to take your life to prove that." And when God finds out what happened, God asks Cain, "Where is your brother?" You remember what Cain said? "Am I my brother's keeper?" We do our best. We do our very best to mimic Adam and Eve and their children. We want to judge what is good and what is bad about each other. So we reject the safekeeping of one another. But just as Eve was flesh from Adam's flesh, Abel was, for all intent and purpose, flesh from Cain's flesh. And we are interconnected as a species. We are, so to speak, flesh from flesh by the very nature of creation itself. Both of the creation stories, even though they are very different, they both tell us that life originates, life spills forth, life comes from God, so that it is connected to God. All things are connected to God and by God and through God and with each other through God and by God and in God. All humans share the same divine DNA. We share the same holy breath that supports our existence. We share the same birthing process, the same physical existence. We share the same inherent cellular requirements for good health and well-being. We are individually unique, like Eve was unique from Adam, but we were created to live in harmony, in that paradise of peace, in a tranquil tandem with each other. We were created to be a collaborating, cooperating force of what God has declared is very, very good. Very good. You saw the cloth, you know today's communion. table that we come to the first Sunday of every month, it reminds us of our God-given equality, and it calls us to God-ordained unity. We are together, flesh from Christ's flesh, blood from Christ's blood, one interconnected body bound up in holy benevolence. So there can be no power struggle here, right? There can be no judgment made at this meal about what's good and what's bad in the creation of God. The bread that's broken for me is the bread that's broken for you. The cup poured out for one of us is the cup that's been poured out for all of us. So whether we are a people common to this congregation or a person fresh off of the streets with all kinds of background and trouble and trash they've carried in with them, right here, we're called to this Eucharist, to this communion, just like we were created as children of God. Everyone, the reflected image of our divine Lord. Life sustained by sacred breath. And each to the other. Each to the other, a corresponding strength of love and of grace. May God find us as God has created us. Amen and amen. Will you join with me in the service of Word and Table?